How about a cup of coffee? Keith looked over at Jill as Marnie ushered Kyle into her office for a counseling session. This is getting to be a habit. Even as she spoke, she reached for her purse and jacket. In the beginning, Jill and Keith had stayed close by during the sessions, but Kyle had taken a great liking to Marnie. Mid-40ish, with large, owl-like glasses and a lively, engaging manner, the therapist had an innate ability to put people of all ages at ease. As a result, Jill and Keith felt comfortable stepping out during the sessions. I can think of worse habits, Keith countered with a grin. No argument there. Jill rose, and Keith held her jacket as she slipped her arms inside. Then he ushered her to the door, his hand in the small of her back. The protective gesture represented nothing more than simple good manners, Jill knew, but it felt good. The late October day was unseasonably warm, and they decided to walk the 3 blocks from the office to the cafe near the water. As they strolled down the sidewalk, Jill's attention was caught by a children's book on orcas whales in a shop window. Dominique had been fascinated by the whales this year, spending hours searching for signs of them with his binoculars. A perfect Christmas gift. I'm going to run in and get that book for Dominic, she told Keith. Why don't you go ahead and save us a table? Okay, I'll see you in a few minutes. 10 minutes later, the book tucked under her arm, Jill climbed the steps to the waterfront coffee shop. There was no sign of Keith, and only one unoccupied table on the terrace. Maybe he had gotten hung up inside. As she stepped over the threshold, it was clear from the line that snaked down the center of the cafe that the shop was doing a booming business. It was a popular spot with tourists, whiling away the time as they waited for the next ferry. She spotted Keith near the waterfront and turned to grab some napkins, planning to go out and secure the one remaining table for them while he placed their order. Reverend Michaels! A female voice boomed across the small shop, and Jill froze, then slowly turned. The woman who was approaching Keith looked to be in her late 50s or early 60s. Jeans hugged her ample thighs and hips, and she wore a purple sweatshirt emblazoned with the words, "Go Falcons," in bright gold letters. A large tote bag was slung over her shoulder, and the camera hanging around her neck banged against her chest in rhythm with each ponderous step she took. "Frank! Frank! Look who's here!" The woman threw the words over her shoulder and continued barreling toward Keith. A video camera toting man with thinning gray hair and a slight build scurried along in her wake. The woman thrust out her hand, leaving Keith no option but to take it. Some of the color had drained from his face, and his subdued response was barely audible over the buzz of the conversation in the small shop. "Hello, Gladys. Frank." Well, imagine meeting you here, of all places. Isn't this the strangest coincidence, Frank? The woman's voice carried easily over the din. Strange, the man agreed, confining his response to one word, as if he knew that was all he'd be able to squeeze in. My word, we do miss you, Reverend. Why, the way you just up and disappeared broke our hearts. Of course, we understood the reasons, and we didn't blame you one bit. But I want you to know we never did believe that hussy. Not for a minute. Did we, Frank? Never did, the man confirmed. And we were right, too. Do you know just a year after she caused you all that sorrow and trouble, the sudden, sonorous boom of the ferry horn set off a flurry of activity in the shop. Come on, Gladys, can't miss the ferry, or we'll be stuck here all night. The older man rushed through the words in one breath, skipping the punctuation, as if afraid that any slight pause would invite an interruption. Taking his wife's arm, he urged her toward the door. The woman hoisted her shoulders, purse higher. I guess we have to go, Reverend, but it was good to see you. I sure am sorry about all the bad things that happened, and I still pray for your dear wife, God rest her soul. I appreciate that. Take care, Reverend. The man held out his hand, and Keith shook it. Within 30 seconds, the place had cleared out as the tourists dashed for the ferry, leaving Keith and Jill alone, surrounded by a sudden, unnatural stillness. Only then did he see her. At her stunned expression, his face went another shade paler. Sir? Sir, can I help you? Forcing himself to look back at the clerk, Keith gave their order by rote before turning back to Jill. I'll meet you outside, okay? His voice was shaky as she felt. With a silent nod, she headed for the deserted terrace. When Keith joined her a couple of minutes later, Jill was still trying to come to grips with the conversation she had overheard. If Keith was a minister, why had he kept it a secret? And why had he left the ministry? Who was the hussy the woman had referred to? What role had she played in Keith's problem? What happened to his wife? Her mind swirled with questions as she looked over at him, but she asked none of them. For whatever reason, he'd kept this past a secret. She had no right to probe, just because she'd been privy to a chance conversation. But she wished he'd felt comfortable enough to tell her about it, that he'd consider their friendship strong enough to withstand whatever he had to say. She thought they'd become closer than that. As Keith set the coffee cups on the table and took his seat, he didn't need a degree in psychology to sense Jill's hurt, or to know that she was overwhelmed with questions. He could read it in her eyes, and he intended to deal with both the questions and the hurt. Gladys's appearance had forced his hand, but it was one he had intended to play within the next few days anyway. It was time he told Jill the reason for his year-long trek. Time he shared with her the pain and sorrow, the humiliation and the anger that had eaten away at him for 2 long years, until her gentle, healing kindness had touched his soul and begun to make it whole again, leading him back to God. He'd come to that conclusion over the past 3 or 4 weeks, as the studio neared completion, and he realized that he was fast approaching a decision point. He'd started spending more time alone, talking to God, seeking guidance, strength, direction, none of which had come overnight. After such a long estrangement, his communication skills with the Lord had been rusty. But when he'd taken his father's advice and simply spoken from his heart, the fog surrounding his life and his future had begun to lift. Though patches of mist continued to obscure parts of the road ahead, one thing had become very clear. It was time to confront his past, deal with his unresolved issues, clear the air, and forgive. And it was also time to stop asking why and let it go, as Jill had done. Only then could he determine his next steps. With his dad acting as intermediary and the corporation of Reverend Thomas, the arrangements were now set for his journey to the past. He hadn't planned to tell Jill his plans in a public place, but the cafe was deserted. There was no reason to put it off, especially in light of the conversation she'd witnessed. "I'm sorry you heard all that, Jill." He gripped his mug with both hands as he looked at her. She focused on the coffee she no longer wanted, tipping in a little cream to lighten the inky blue. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but she was talking really loud and—" When he reached over and took her cold fingers in his warm clasp, the words died in her throat. "That's not what I meant. I'm just sorry you heard it in that way," he clarified. "I'd planned to tell you the story before I leave next week." Jill felt as if she had been slapped. She jerked her head up and stared at him, her stomach twisting into a knot. You're leaving next week?" At her bereft expression, Keith gave her fingers a gentle, reassuring squeeze. "I have some unfinished business to attend to. I won't be gone long." Confused, she stared back at him. You're coming back?" "I'd like to, if that's okay with you. I've got another job lined up over in Deer Harbor." He was staying. Maybe not forever, but at least for a while. Thank you, God. "Sure, the cabin will still be here." The warmth of his smile sent a tingle all the way to her toes. But as he released her hand and took a sip of coffee, the curve of his lips flattened into a grim line. "There are a lot of things you do not know about me, Jill. Are you really a minister?" "I was, for 12 years, at a little church in Ohio. Ever since I was a young boy, I'd felt the calling to serve the Lord in ministry, and it was everything I'd expected. life was good for a long time. I had a lovely wife, work that mattered and that fulfilled me, a close relationship with God, a congregation that supported me, and I valued what I did. Everything was perfect. I felt very blessed. Setting his coffee aside, he turned to stare out over the harbor, his troubled expression at odds with the sunny sky above and the boats gaily bobbing in the clear water. Then things started to change. My wife Ellen and I both wanted children, but she suffered 2 miscarriages back to back. After the first one, she became very depressed, which seemed normal to me. Who wouldn't be sad about losing a baby? I grieved over it too, but I put it in the Lord's hands and tried to console her. Nothing helped, though, until she got pregnant again. For a while, things were good. Then complications set in, and she lost that baby too. After that, the depression returned with a vengeance. I'd never witnessed despair that dark, and it scared me to death. Her behavior became erratic, and it got to the point that I was afraid to leave her alone. Her doctor said her melancholy was intensified by hormonal changes and prescribed some medication, but she'd often forgotten to take it, and she began to spiral deeper and deeper into darkness. A chill rippled through Jill, triggered more by the ominous nature of Keith's story than a sudden change in air temperature caused by a passing cloud that briefly obscured the sun. I worried about Ellen all the time, Keith continued. When I was with her, when I wasn't with her, I'd call every couple of hours, and I asked neighbors to stop in and check on her throughout the day. To say I was distracted would be an understatement. For the first time in my life, I felt unable to cope. And despite my prayers for guidance, the Lord was silent. I couldn't imagine how things could get worse. Until they did. A muscle clenched in his jaw, and his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. While all this was going on, I was counseling a young woman in our congregation. She was having marital problems, and she requested more and more sessions. I was so distracted by my personal concerns that I didn't realize she had begun to offer more than sympathy for my situation. When her intent finally registered, I told her that I had no interest in the comfort she was willing to provide, and referred her elsewhere for counseling. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. She didn't take kindly to being rejected. I just didn't realize how angry or vindictive she could be. A cold, hard look gripped Keith's feature, one Jill had never seen before, and another chill chased its way down her spine. A few days later, Suzanne, that was her name, called me. She sounded almost suicidal, and she asked me to meet with her once more. Since I was already dealing with Ellen's depression, I understood how unstable it could make a person, and I couldn't in good conscience refuse her request. Nor would I have been able to live with myself if I turned her down, and she took some desperate measure. She suggested we meet in a public place, a park near the center of town. I figured that would be safe and agreed. I got there first. When she arrived, she seemed very agitated. I urged her to sit down, but she paced around in front of me, talking about how unhappy she was in her marriage and how she'd made a mistake. The same things I'd heard in our previous sessions. Then, all of a sudden, she started to sway like she was going to faint. I grabbed her, and the next thing I knew, she she pulled me toward her and kissed me. Before I could react, she jerked away and slapped me. I remember her saying in a very loud voice, "I told you I'm not interested, Reverend. I'm sorry you're having problems at home, but I'm a happily married woman." And then she ran off. Drawing an unsteady breath, Keith looked back at Jill. It was a setup, of course. When I turned around, I saw one of the elders from our church with his family. Somehow, Susan had gotten wind of the fact that they were planning a picnic in the park, and she arranged our meeting knowing that he'd witnessed the whole thing. To complicate matters, he'd never been one of my strongest supporters. He thought I was too traditional in my interpretation of scripture, and we'd often clash. Anyway, the scandal swept through the town like wildfire. Of course, I denied everything, but Suzanne stuck to her story, putting on an act worthy of an Academy Award. When he continued, his voice went flat. Bottom line, the board asked me to resign. After all the clergy scandals in recent years, they wanted to distance themselves from anything that even smelled of impropriety. Under normal circumstances, I would have fought such an unjust accusation with everything in me. But the scandal and the whispers and the pressure proved too much for Ellen, in her already precarious mental state, and she took her own life. His voice broke. Resting his elbows on the table, he pressed his lips against his laced fingers and closed his eyes. Horrified by this tale, Jill reached out and laid her hand on Keith's shoulders. She felt hate bubble up deep inside her, hate for a woman she'd never met, whose vindictive actions had turned this kind, good man's world upside down and robbed him of both his wife and his work. Though she searched desperately for words of comfort, she knew there was nothing she could say to assuage his grief. All she could do was touch him and hope that somehow he could feel her caring and sympathy through her fingertips, just as she could feel the tremors that rippled through his body. When Keith at last opened his eyes, the moisture at their corners told her that he was using every ounce of his willpower to hold on to his composure. She yearned to gather him into her arms and comfort him, as she'd done with Kyle, to hold him until his shaking stopped and the world steadied. But it would take more than a simple hug to set Keith's world right. After Ellen died, I didn't have it in me to fight, he continued in an unsteady voice. I was too filled with hate and anger at Suzanne and the congregation at life, at God. So I walked away without even leaving a forwarding address. My father took care of tying up the loose ends for me. I wanted nothing more to do with that town or that church. As Jill looked at Keith's ravaged face, feeling his pain as if it were hers, it occurred to her that there were many ways for people to be damaged. Some bore their scars in a manner seen by the eye, others in a manner seen only by the heart. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was too, for myself." He looked at her steadily, cutting himself no slack. "I didn't think that I deserved what had happened to me, that as a minister I was somehow better than anyone else. It's taken me 2 long years to get past that. The first year I worked with my dad, hoping time would heal my wounds. When it didn't, I started traveling, looking for answers. After almost a year of wandering, I reached the end of the road, literally. When I came to Orcas Island, I'd never been more down in my life than the night I arrived on your doorsteps." He leaned forward. "But I've learned a lot since then, Jill, about accepting God's will, about letting go, about moving on. That's why I need to go back to Ohio, to finish some business I should have taken care of 2 years ago, to set the records straight so that I can move forward ahead with my life." "But move where?" Jill wanted to ask. However, her spoken words were different. That makes sense. For several long beats of silence, Keith's gaze held hers captive, as if he wanted to say more. But in the end, he checked his watch, took a final sip of his coffee, and stood. Cal would be waiting for us. He reached for her hand and drew her to her feet, his face inches from hers, those blue eyes, warm and inviting. "Thanks for listening, Jill." His husky tone and tender expression played havoc with her metabolism. She had to clear her throat twice before she could respond, managing no more than a whisper. "Thank you for sharing." He gave her hand a squeeze, then led the way to the steps, guiding her down with a clasp that was sure and strong. And even after they reached level ground, he didn't let go. It was a day of mixed emotions, starting off in celebratory mood with an official ribbon-cutting ceremony for Jill's studio. A homemade cinnamon coffee cake was cooling on the kitchen counter, and she'd strung a yellow ribbon in the studio doorway. When the time came, they trooped across the yard to the new structure, and she handed the scissors to Kyle, who stood between her and Keith. "Will you do the honors, Kyle?" Wide-eyed, the little boy stared up at her. "Me? Yes. You've helped Keith so much that I think you should cut the ribbon. Don't you, Keith?" "Absolutely." A flush of pleasure colored the boy's cheeks as he took the scissors. "Okay. But first, I'd like to say a few words of thanks." Jill bowed her head and linked fingers with Kyle, then reached for Keith's hand to complete the circle. "Lord, we stand before you today in gratitude for the many blessings you have given us. We thank you for bringing us together in this time and in this place to share and to learn and to grow. We ask that you guide us in the months and years ahead so that we may walk in your path at all times. And we ask that you help us to always to remember to share with others the many gifts you have given us. Grant us your strength when we falter, your compassion when we err, your consolation when we are hurting. Fill us with your love so we never forget, even on dark and lonely days, that we are never alone, that you are always by our side. And finally, Lord, help me to use the special room that Keith and Kyle have built to honor the glory of your creation. When she finished, Jill looked over at Keith. Would you like to add anything? I think you said it all. He stroked his thumb over the back of her hand before he released it. That was beautiful, Jill. His smile was like the sun on a warm spring day, and the husky quality of his voice set off a flutter in her stomach. Okay, Kyle. Using both hands, the little boy lifted the scissors and snipped the ribbon while Keith recorded the moment with his camera. As the two ends fluttered to the ground, he and Jill applauded. Then she stepped over the threshold and surveyed her dream of a studio, brought to life by Keith. She'd been inside during the building process, of course, but the finished structure, now cleared of construction debris, almost took her breath away. Although Keith had worked from her drawings, he'd enhanced and embellished her ideas, creating a space that was as beautiful as it was practical. Skylights in the vaulted ceiling were positioned to best catch the light, and three sides of the building featured banks of windows. The overall effect was almost like being outdoors. It's too pretty to mess up with my paints. Jill's tone was odd as she moved around the room, her face alight with joy. In fact, I'm tempted to move in here. Keith grinned. I'm glad you like it. Like it? I love it. She twirled around and, on impulse, reached out to hug the man who had made her vision a reality. His arms went around her, and he briefly pressed his cheek to her hair, inhaling her pleasing, fresh scent before she pulled back and smiled up at him. As he studied the woman whose goodness and sweetness had helped him find his way out of darkness, Keith marveled at the changes that had been wrought in her as well. If he had never believed in miracles before, he now had proof of one in his arms. Like a butterfly, she'd left her cocoon, transformed with wings that were ready to soar. Where once she'd hidden her face under a hat and stayed in the shadows, she now enhanced the sunshine. Despite the bright light that outlined every flaw, she was unself-conscious about her scars, at least with him. His throat tightened with tenderness, and he was tempted to express the depth of his feelings in a way that left no doubt in her mind that she was beautiful and appealing woman in every way that mattered. Jill saw a spark ignite in Keith's eyes, and for an instant she stopped breathing. Like that night on the porch, when he'd interrupted the tense scene with Kyle's grandfather, she had the distinct impression that he wanted to kiss her. Then she'd thought the urge had been driven by consolation, by a need to reassure her that the danger was past. In this case, she wasn't as sure about the motivation. Of course, she knew he liked her, but liking and attraction were two different things. He was probably just caught up in the excitement of the moment, responding to her euphoria. It couldn't be anything more, could it? This is really nice, Keith. It's bright and sunny and happy. I I like it a whole lot. So lost was Jill in Keith's eyes that it took several seconds for Kyle's words to register. When they did, she blinked once, twice, and tried to regroup. Had Kyle said a whole sentence? Not just one, but three? Forcing herself to turn and step out of Keith's arms, Jill lowered herself to Kyle's level and gave him a glowing smile. So do I... You guys did a great job. Keith dropped down beside her, and from the look he gave her, she knew he hadn't missed the significance of Kyle's milestone. I couldn't have done it without you, buddy. He laid his hand on the youngster's shoulder. A flush of pleasure warmed the boy's face. What are you going to paint first? He asked Jill. As a matter of fact, I have a very special project in mind, but since it's a surprise, you'll have to wait and see. And in the meantime, how about we go try that cake? The festive air continued as they trooped into the kitchen, which was filled with enticing aroma of cinnamon. As they took their places at the table, Jill cut them each a generous wedge of the cake and passed out forks. Though they were celebrating the completion of her studio, the easy banter and laughter in the room was yet another blessing that filled her with gratitude. Kyle was on his second piece when Keith shot her a look, and she nodded. This was one part of the day she wasn't looking forward to. Given Kyle's growing attachment to the man he'd once taken great pains to avoid, she and Keith had talked to Marnie at length about Keith's upcoming trip, seeking her advice about how best to position it to ensure that Kyle didn't suffer any setbacks. Her counsel had seemed sound, and they'd planned to follow it to the letter. Jill prayed it would mitigate the effect of Keith's departure and reassure Kyle that the man he was fast becoming to idolize was indeed returning. Kyle, I have a job for you to do, Keith began, keeping his tone conversational. Okay. The youngster looked at him expectantly as he put another bite of cake in his mouth. I have to go on a little trip. I'll be gone a few days, and I'd like you to take good care of my tools while I'm away. They're very important to me because I can't do my work without them. If I leave my toolbox right by your bed, Can you keep it safe until I get back? The little boy stopped chewing. You're going away? Just for a few days. I'll be back real soon. Keith took the boy's small hand in his, never breaking eye contact. Why do you... Kyle stopped, leaving the rest of the question unasked. There are some things I have to do back where I used to live, and I want to visit my father too, Keith responded. His hand trembling, Kyle set his fork down and stared at Keith with wide, fearful eyes. He won't hurt you, will he? A muscle clenched in Keith's jaw, and he shot Jill a quick look. She could see the restrained fury in his eyes, prompted by an anger that any man, let alone a child's father, could treat a youngster as Kyle had been treated. But he shuddered them before he looked back at Kyle. Nobody, he won't. My father's a very nice man. I love him very much. When I was a little boy, he took me fishing and played catch with me in the backyard and brought ice cream home for us. I miss him, and he misses me. That's why I want to go and see him. For several long seconds, Kyle digested that. I don't miss my dad. His voice was small, and he looked down at the table. That's okay. He wasn't very nice to you. Most of the time, we only miss people who are nice to us. I'll miss you. And I'd miss Jill if she went away. Her throat tight, Jill laid a hand on Kyle's shoulder. I'm not going anywhere, Kyle, she promised in a choked voice. And in that moment she knew that she could never send this fragile younger boy to live with anyone else. That even if she had to be a single parent, she wanted to adopt him and do all she could to heal his wounds and give him the kind of home he had never known. I love you, Kyle, she whispered. His head jerked up as if he'd never before heard those words. And I want us to stay together for always, she continued, blinking back tears. She felt Keith's intent gaze, but she kept looking at Kyle. It was important that he see the sincerity in her eyes, to know without any doubt that he was wanted and loved and valued. You mean I can stay with you for always? I'm going to call Cindy, that nice social worker, and talk to her about it tomorrow. Would you like that, Kyle? Yes. The tense line of his shoulders relaxed, and he gave Jill one of his rare smiles. Only when he picked up his fork once more and began to eat again did she risk a peek at Keith. I didn't know about that, he said quietly. I didn't either, for sure, until just now. But I want to do this, Keith. Her gaze was steady and certain. Do what? Kyle inquired. For an instant, Keith's hard-to-read look had made her forget that Kyle was present and very much aware of the conversation taking place over his head. Just something I have to do tomorrow, that's all, she responded, forcing a smile to her lips. I guess you like that cake, hmm? Yeah. I think I'll have another piece too, Keith. No thanks. As she cut herself a second small slice and returned to the table, Jill had the nagging feeling that she'd somehow disappointed Keith, but she had no idea why. If she wanted to take on the job of raising Kyle, why should he care? It was her responsibility, not his. She was used to trusting her own judgment, making her own decisions. And this had been a good one, even if even if Keith didn't seem all that enthusiastic. But her certainty couldn't overcome the sick feeling in the pit of her stomach that for some reason Keith disapproved of her decision. And when she picked up her fork, she realized that her appetite had vanished, along with the happy glow she'd felt at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Unless God was on their side, they were going to miss the ferry. With a worried glance at her watch, Jill pressed harder on the accelerator. The boat was always on schedule, and it never lingered at the dock more than 5 or 10 minutes, especially in the off-season. There was very little margin for error. She thought they'd left the house in plenty of time, but she hadn't counted on the road's construction that had required a detour over Dolphin Bay Road, which was partially unpaved and slow going. We'll make it, Jill. She took her attention off the road, enough to give Keith a quick, anxious look. I'm not so sure. We should have eaten lunch sooner, but no one seemed hungry after the coffee cake this morning. If you miss the ferry, you'll miss the bus in Anna Courts, and you won't get back to Seattle in time for your plane. Why had this car picked yesterday to die? Reaching over, he laid a reassuring hand on her arm. Let's leave it in God's hands, okay? I know in my heart he wants me to do this. We'll have to trust that everything will work out. Good advice. And Jill tried to follow it. But since she was in the driver's seat, she felt more than a little pressure to fulfill her role in God's plan to Keith to the boat on time. As it turned out, they made it, with mere minutes to spare. The hulking craft was still moored at the dock when they pulled into Orca's village, but no cars were lined up waiting to drive on, meaning the loading was complete and the horn would sound any second to signal the boat's departure. See, I told you we'd make it, Keith noted with a smile. I won't feel sure about that until you're on board. She set the car brake and released the trunk latch. Why don't you grab your bag while I run over and let one of the cruisemen know they have another passenger? Kyle, stay with Keith, okay? Without waiting for a response, Jill dashed toward the boat. Only when Keith and Kyle joined her a couple of minutes later did she feel the tension in her shoulders ease. You'd better board, she told Keith, jamming her hands into the deep pockets of her jacket. Ever since Jill had revealed her plans to adopt Kyle this morning, Keith had sensed a certain awkwardness between them, due, he supposed, to his reaction to her announcement. In retrospect, he realized that she might have interpreted his surprise as disapproval. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. He was all for the idea. It was just that he had expected them to talk it over first. But why should she feel compelled to discuss choices about her future with him? He'd never given her any indication of his growing feelings, or his hopes that he might be a part of her future. It hadn't seemed appropriate to do so until he was free of the past, until the way was cleared for him to make some promises about tomorrow. But he couldn't leave on this uncomfortable note. Although departure preparations had kept him busy most of the morning, he'd hoped they'd have a few minutes to discuss the situation. That didn't seem to be in the cards now. For one thing, time was short. For another, it wasn't a subject he wanted to talk about in front of Kyle. Then inspiration struck. He dug in his pocket and withdrew a handful of change, holding it out to Kyle. "Why don't you run into the store and get one of those ice cream bars you like?" he suggested. Often in the past, as they waited to catch the ferry to Friday Harbor for a counseling session, they'd indulge in a treat from the neighborhood store at the dock. Kyle's face lit up as a small fist closed around the coins. You won't leave till I get back, will you?" "No, I still have a couple of minutes," Keith promised. As Kyle took off at a run, Keith turned to Jill. She had her hat on today, and the brim hid her face as she stared out at the blue water, the surface sparkling like diamonds in the sky. "Jill?" At the sound of his voice, she turned to him. "I'm sorry if my reaction this morning to your announcement about adopting Kyle upset you." "It's okay." But her stiff shrug, as she once more turned away, told him it wasn't. "I know I can't give him an ideal home. He won't have the kind of family I had, but it will be better than being passed around in foster care his whole life. And I do love him, Keith, as much as if he were my own child. I hope that helps compensate for other things he'll lack." Setting his case on the ground beside him, Keith reached for her arms, urging her with a gentle pressure to face him. "Jill, I don't disapprove. I can't think of anyone who would take better care of Kyle or give him a more loving home. He belongs with you. I was just surprised that you'd never mentioned it, but I guess I've never given you any reason to think you should discuss those kinds of decisions with me." He paused, trying to find the words to express all that he felt for this special woman. "The thing is, I—" The ferry horn boomed, cutting him off, and the crew moved into position to release the tethers that anchored the boat to dock. "You need to go," Jill told him. "They won't wait." Keith didn't loosen his grip. He couldn't leave like this, couldn't walk away from Jill without giving her some indication of how he felt. This wasn't the time or the place for emotional declarations, but he had to at least offer her a glimpse into his heart. You need to leave, Keith. Jill's voice grew more urgent. The ferry horn sounded again, and she tried to draw away, but he held her fast. Prepared to object, she looked up at him, but the words died in her throat as he lowered his lips to claim hers in a tender, gentle kiss. For several eternal seconds, time seemed to stop. She was too surprised to respond, to object, to do anything but cling to his arms for support. When at last he pulled back far enough to look into her eyes, she stared at him in confusion. Why did you do that? Reaching up, he brushed a soft strand of hair back from her face and responded in a voice that was as unsteady as the small boats bobbing in the harbor beside the hulking ferry. Why do you think? At her stunned, perplexed look, Keith realized that she really didn't understand the message he was trying to communicate. Why does a man usually kiss a woman, Jill? He prompted, his voice as soft, as tender as a lover's caress. She knew the answer to that, of course, but in her case, it didn't fit. No man could be attracted to a woman so disfigured. Putting a hand to her cheek, she turned away in silence, blinking to clear the sudden film of moisture in her eyes. His expression troubled. Keith studied the woman beside him. She'd made such strides in her recentry into society. It simply hadn't occurred to him that in their relationship she'd still harbor such insecurities, be so conscious of her disfigurement. Yet her reaction affirmed the depth of her scars, not just the visible ones, but the ones etched on her heart as well. Truth be told, she was far more conscious of her disfigurement than he was. Sometime during these past few months, as he and Jill had shared meals and conversation and trips with Kyle, her scars had faded into insignificance for him. Her inner beauty was what attracted him, her warm heart, her loving ways, her deep faith, her generous and giving spirit. Those were the things that made her special, and long after the years robbed them both of physical appeal, those qualities would continue to shine in her, ageless and new, still able to tighten his throat with emotion and fill his heart with love. But there was no time to say all of those things now. They would have to wait until... Keith! Keith! Kyle was running toward him as fast as his short legs could carry him. I heard the horn. He screeched to a stop in front of Keith, puffing, and thrust a small package of licorice into his hand. Confused, Keith stared at the cell phone bag. Instead of getting his favorite ice cream treat, Kyle had chosen the candy that Keith always bought for himself when they purchased snacks for their ferry trips. Keith was overwhelmed by the unselfish going away present from a little boy who'd known little or no generosity or kindness until he met Jill. Blinking away the sudden moisture that clouded his vision, he dropped down and pulled the boy close, burying his face in his slight shoulder. "Thank you, Kyle." He held him as long as he dared, and when he rose, his intense gaze sought Jill's. "We'll talk more when I get back." And then he was gone, sprinting for the boat, boarding with mere seconds to spare. He remained on the deck as it pulled away from the dock, his overnight case by his side, until the ferry shrank to a distant speck in the distance. Only when it disappeared from sight did Jill and Kyle turn toward the car. As she took his hands, he looked up at her. "He's really coming back, isn't he, Jill?" "Yes, Kyle, he is." "Promise?" "Yes, I promise." It wasn't a pledge Jill took lightly, nor was it one she had any qualms about making. She realized as her heart soared with fragile, new-found hope, because the look in Keith's eyes just now, before he had raced for the ferry, had been filled with that very thing, promise.